Okay, and you can go.
Do you want to go through the slides?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. So I just want you to know that the UiPath developer meetings are really managed by MVPs in Canada, Latin America, and USA. Tonight we're doing it from the Houston region, and you're encouraged to network with the MVPs and share your LinkedIn URLs in the chat box because we really want to get to know you guys. Now, these sessions are really for you guys to ask questions, participate, let us know what topics you're interested in the community so that we can bring them to you and create new sessions. And then again, please put your questions that you have in the chat. And if you do have any topics, if you don't put them in chat, then please just email me and let me know what they are so we can arrange to have those sessions done. And then if you go to the next slide, so tonight is our first session on this series. It's UiPath Tips and Techniques for Exception Planning, Session 1. That's happening now. And I'll put the recording information in the chat. And then we have 2 more sessions, one on the 18th and one on the 25th. So I will also put those URLs in the chat for you to register for. So Chris, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool beans. Hey guys, my name's Chris. I'm an MVP at UiPath. I work for run the GameStop COE. Been here for less than a year doing that. Before this, I've ran the Mary Kay COE, if any of you are Mary Kay users. I've been working with UiPath for about 6 years. I've built a little over 400, well, it's a lot over 400 automations now. I teach UiPath to college students, mentor college students, and I teach UiPath in high school as well. Joining us today is also Priya, who leads the Houston chapter. Priya, say hello. Priya.
Hi.
You're on mute.
First. Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you so much. And just like Chris, I'm also a UiPath MVP. I work as an independent freelance automation freelancer. So I've been doing UiPath for over 6 years now. And we host a lot of virtual sessions in the Houston chapter. So if you're ever looking for like any specific topics, again, like you can just like ping us on LinkedIn, or just like we've got like a LinkedIn group as well, or even on forums. Like if you have like any roadblocks or anything, again, like you can reach out to me, Chris, or even Naveen, who's also on the call. So please feel free to use the chat, and we'll share our links shortly in our chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. So we're gonna talk about exception handling and error handling. And today we're gonna just talk, and then I'll show you a couple things. Then the next session, I'm gonna show you some studio tools, demonstrate some studio tools. In the last section, I'm gonna do some debugging and demonstrate debugging in alpha testing. Alpha testing just means developer testing. I don't know if everybody else calls it alpha testing. I call it alpha testing. And we do that before we throw it into UAT, user acceptance testing. So let me dispel any type of fantasies you have in your brain about, and any of you that are thinking that you're going to live in a world of unicorns and rainbows. Your automations are going to fault. It is inevitable. It is not anything that you necessarily can control. Some of it you can. Some people are taught to the shiny new toy. I'm going to automate all these processes or all these jobs, and they just start faulting. You have no idea why. You don't know. I mean, I'm sure Priya can attest to this. You don't know how many times I get emails or questions from people that say, well, it worked yesterday, it doesn't work today. And I don't know what changed. It should work, but it's not working anymore. Or the code worked just the other day and now it's all changed. Your automation is going to fall, and that it's inevitable. And so we're going to try and do the best we can. You will never reach Six Sigma as a KPI in UiPath. I shouldn't say never. I mean, somebody may be perfect, but I haven't seen it done. I've written 400 different automations in my career, and I have automations fault. I had one fault this morning and I couldn't figure it out. And it worked yesterday, by the way. So difference in my world, and I'm going to tell you Chris's view of life and Chris's view of RPA. This may differ than Priya's. It may differ than another automation developer or another COE leader, but this is Chris's view. I see a distinct difference between an error and an exception. An error is something that you may not necessarily be able to plan for. Let's say you're using a cloud system. You're going into a cloud system, and since you don't own that cloud system, you cannot control that cloud system, and your cloud vendor decides, hey, we want to revamp our UI and make it more user-friendly. You can't plan that. You can't know that. And that in my world is an error. And that's something that there are some things you can do, and there are some tools available to you to handle how the bot encounters and handles those errors, but it's still going to be an error. An exception, in Chris's view of the world, is something you should have known you didn't plan for. All right, plain and simple. Business exception, a process exception, code exception. You didn't work the process well enough at the beginning, so you have an exception. Now, UiPath uses those interchangeably. You have system exception, you have business exceptions. I call one an error, one an exception. And an exception, if you're a developer, and those of you who are on the call are developers, I don't know how many are developers or how many are starting out. It is vitally important to you, for you, to be involved with that automation process at the beginning. I know that some people work for a group that has a BA, a business analyst, that does all the front end work for you. You should be on those calls as well. You should be familiar with that business process because you're the one that builds it. And you're going to be the one that knows what questions to ask that a BA may not know. Or a solution architect or somewhere along that lines. They may not know to ask the questions that you know to ask. And as you build more and more and more, you're going to learn more and more questions to ask. So you need to be in that defined process where you're defining the whole scope of everything before you step back and let the BA do some other things. And you always want to be in contact with your BA and the business team at the same time, because that is how you're going to make sure that you have a robust automation that's not going to work one day and that's going to work one day and not work the next. That's your job. Part of that, and Diana's posted several of these for me, and part of that, and she knows I'm going to sit here and talk to you about documentation. Your process design document is going to be key to you handling what a business exception is, or an exception that you can plan for. So I'm going to share that in a moment. I think I need to go to a slide because I start, guys, and I start rambling, so someone has to kind of guide me back because I will go off on a tangent and never return back to the main subject. We talked about how you know exceptions will occur because you're going to be involved in the whole business process. You have to understand, and I've said this, I think 100 times on Diana on these calls as well. A business process starts at some point. At some point for whoever you're building for, if you're building for your own COE, if you're building for a consulting firm, for a client, if you're doing freelance work, that process started at some point, whether it was a new system, a new rule in accounting, a new warehouse management system, somewhere, how that process began. And as that process developed manually between people running the process, changes in the process were made, or problems were in the process were made. If any of you are Six Sigma people, we call that root cause analysis. You had something go wrong. And the people then overcame that process fault by changing their process. Okay? In many instances, you're putting a bot whose brain is completely empty, except for what you program into it, which makes you kind of like God to a bot. And if you don't know what those people encountered along the way, and you have to teach the bot to encounter those same things. Let's say, for example, well, when this screen doesn't pop up, we just have to click this link and then it takes us to the screen a different way. Well, bot doesn't know that. The developer doesn't know that. The business team knows that. They're not always going to tell you because that becomes part of that process as it evolves. So 10 years later, that's just part of the process. You need to understand that full process. And those are what I call in my world, Chris's world, we'll call it that, human developed process rules. That's just how the process works. It's how it's always worked. And you're going in with a fresh look and you have to plan for those things. Systems don't always work. And you'd be surprised. In my COEs, each one of our bots sits in its own server. And servers fill with junk, right? We have our bots do self-maintenance. We call them bot showers. They clean their own cache. They clean their own emails out once every day, every Friday. The bots go through and clean out all their emails, their sent emails, and everything that's older than 30 days. So the bots that we build, they take showers every day, and once a week. It's actually several times a day they clean themselves. Your servers do not. So you have to come up with some sort of system, some sort of scripting, some sort of schedule where your servers can be rebooted. Because if your servers aren't rebooted, your bot's going to fall. So there are some architecture things that you can do on your end, or your COE can do, or your client can do that you can suggest to make sure that their automations continue to run robustly until they reach an error or a system error that you cannot control. So systems don't always work. You may have a vendor partner that you're using their system and they decide, well, we're going to do an upgrade. This happened to me 2 weeks ago. We're going to do an upgrade. And they don't notify you that they're doing an upgrade. Okay. That's when we get what we call release documents. Every vendor, well, I say every, and that's me living in a unicorn world. Most vendors, if you're a client of their system, they will have something they call release documents. And that will tell you when they're going to do an upgrade, whether it's just a minor security patch. Sometimes we'll just throw the UI off. Even if you go through an API, or they're doing a full-fledged upgrade, you want to have those release notes so you can see what the impact is going to be on your bots or your automations that you have tied to those systems that you're using, that vendor has. So that you can get a picture of the scope of what you have to do. Now, when we build automations, the general rule I have is 85% build, 15% maintenance. And that 15% maintenance should be limited as much as possible to things you cannot control. Unforeseen exceptions, unforeseen errors. So you want to have release documents. When you're going in a system, in a client or a department within your organization says, hey, we want you to go into this accounting system or this ERP system or this contract or conditional contract system. You want to make sure that who's going to send you the release documents? Who's going to keep you updated on system upgrades? Because if you don't know, you can't plan for that. Okay, a system exception. What happens to a system exception? And there's a couple things we're going to talk about how you can control system exception. A system exception is when the bot generally logs into a system or interacts with the system and the system is not behaving as you coded that bot to encounter or interact with that system. We call that a system exception. Anybody that I work with or anybody that I mentor, anybody I train, anybody I teach, whether at a high school or college level, we only build in an RE framework, or we only build in a linear, which is a modified RE framework. And if you want to know the differences of those, I'll be more than happy to send you those templates. And within those RE frameworks, we have what we call a consecutive system exception. Okay. And that means that your bot's going to trying to do what you taught it to do, and it's going to retry it until you set that consecutive system exception to tell it, okay, it's not going to work, guys. I'm going to stop. Your bot's not going to stop unless you tell it when to stop. It's going to keep going. And then you have what we call an infinite loop. The other thing is we can use a global exception handler, and I'll show you both of those here in a few minutes. Okay. A business exception is you went to the business, they gave you the specs of what they wanted done. You worked out through the PDD what it's going to do. You flow charted their current process. You flow charted the to-be process. You identified every possible exception that they told you about. And then someone says, oh, I just decided to move the column headings around. Or I decide to name the tab something different. Or I just changed the name of the worksheet, or I just changed where we store that now going forward. That's a business exception. That's when the group that you're working for, the client you're building for, they changed their business process, okay? And that changed that business process, knocked your automation off track. And I keep saying bot, there's a difference. Bot is a program that carries about the automation. So when I say bot, that's interchangeable. And your automation was knocked off track. That's a business exception. It's not a system problem. It's not your coding problem. That's a business problem. And typically when that happens in my automations, they get an email saying, I can't do this. You changed something. Something's changed. I can't do this. And usually that email also says, you will need to do this manually until you set some time with me to sit down and tell me what you changed so I can work that into my maintenance queue. Okay. So in my world, if you change your process, you're taking the risk that my maintenance queue may be 3 or 4 weeks out. So you're going to have to do it manually for 3 or 4 weeks. Okay. So let's look at a process design document. And I'm sure everybody's seen this before. Now, this is the old standard one, the legacy standard one that UiPath used to use. They've changed it a little bit, but I want to talk to you about a couple of key areas. And I'm going to scoot up and you're going to get kind of dizzy, and I apologize for that. This is the first part where you're going to be able to identify exceptions to your process or possible exceptions to your process, the as-is process map. That's where you're sitting down with the people and you're saying, how do you do it? What is it that your team does with the inputs? What outputs do you generate? What happens if this happens? What happens if this happens? And you're going to detail that as the as-is process detail. I love to flowchart. It makes sense in my brain. Flowcharting just fits in my brain. I don't know why. That probably means I'm a nerd or a boring person, but it fits. And then we do process steps. Now you will find in some process design documents, each one of these will end up in a row and you'll have a split table and it'll tell you what you're doing, things like that. The next thing you want to do is the to be, okay? This is where you're telling the business team, based on the process that you just mapped out for me, this is what the bot's going to do, okay? It may be totally different than what they've been doing because you're putting automation towards it. But part of it may be the same. And in some cases, the entire process may be the same. And you're going to tell them what it's going to do. And they're going to read this and say, oh, wait, if you do that here, this may happen. Okay. This is an interactive document. This is not a final say on your process until someone signs off on it and takes that accountability off your shoulders. Okay. Because then you can blame them instead of blame yourself. And we always like to blame other people, right? The next part of the process design document I'll point out is this business exceptions handling. Okay. Business exceptions handling, again, remember what I said, it's where the business team changed something on you. And you're going to detail how we're going to handle that. Mine typically says the business team is going to get an email. They'll get a copy of the inputs that they sent to me back in case somebody didn't save theirs. And you're going to get a detail of what the bot encountered. Okay. What's that exception mean? Now, UiPath is going to shoot out all this language to you from your staff. You don't want to give them that because they're not going to necessarily understand it. You want to be able to decipher within your RE framework where that happened. Maybe if it's in an application, take a screenshot. We'll talk about that tomorrow, next week. But you want to give them as much detail so they understand where it faulted, because otherwise you may have some very large automations that you're going to have to dig through with the business team and you're going to have to help find. Okay. Next part. These are known and unknown. So how are you going to handle unknown exceptions? These would be business exceptions. How are you going to handle an unknown business exception? Let's say Susie decided, and hopefully there's nobody on here named Susie. I apologize if I'm using your name. Let's say Susie decided that she was going to change the name of the file that goes into it because it doesn't match the other names. And it's easier for her to decipher which files she needs to worry about, which she doesn't, okay? That to you is an unknown exception. Now, you may think, okay, someone's going to change this file name at some point within the next 5 or 10 years. Are you really, you can build that in, but I'm not sure that it's going to really, if it's going to be worth the code to build that in, or if it'll ever happen, but you can. But these are unknown business exceptions. What are you going to have the bot do? How is a bot going to handle those? Okay. I use the global exception handler when something like that happens. Okay. Application exception handling, that's your system part. That's the part where you had an upgrade. Their system's down because of a tunnel collapse. You have something wrong with the system. The bot cannot interact with it. Perhaps they have a big conference coming up, and I have this one system that just drives me crazy, because every week they'll have some sort of advertisement they throw onto the landing page. And it's not even consecutively on the same day every week. And there's no way you can actually give the bot what it's going to say to click through, because you have to go through this whole conniption of clearing this screen. So when we had that application exception, I had the bot stop and take a screenshot so I can see what the bot saw, because my bots run in the background. I don't do attended bots. I don't do citizen development in my COEs. So I don't necessarily know what the bot sees until the bot encounters it. So I do a lot of screenshots. So application error exception handling. And here you can also think to yourself, okay, so this is a third-party system. What can go wrong? Well, let's say the login page doesn't show up because there's this advertisement. Let's say that the landing page is different. You're looking for an element to exist somewhere. Let's say the API is not working anymore. Those are things that you can plan for as application exceptions that you can code into your automation. Because they may happen, and if you're dealing with a third party or a cloud system, they will happen. So don't worry about it. They will happen. So you want to plan those. And then you have unknown. Same here. How are you going to deal with unknowns? How are you going to have the bot react to unknowns? And you want the business to fully understand this is what the bot's going to do if these things happen. Okay. So the business is aware if their automation, if they're not getting an output, and you have, in my case, you have 7 bots running a ton of automations, and I'm not going to sit there. I don't sit there and look at the log messages or the log files until someone tells me, hey, something didn't happen. That's when I know, unless something flashes red on my screen, and I don't like red and it says faulted. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully I didn't ramble enough. I mean, too much, and I stayed on point. So that's one of my goals. Okay, let's talk a bit about the RE framework. RE framework. Now, this is not the linear. This is the regular RE framework. I'm sure all of us have seen this before, and if you're not building within an RE framework, shame on you. Because the RE framework has handled a lot of your exception planning for you built in. You're still going to need to add some exception planning, but the RE framework is going to take care of a large part of it. All right, we're going to talk about the global handler. It's this little guy here. You can only have one global exception handler per automation. You can't have one for every screen. You can't have one in the process state compared to the transaction detail state. And you can have a global handler in a linear RE framework or a regular RE framework. You're going to set that little guy down here, or you're going to set him in your framework section. And this is very simple, okay? The bot's going to capture the information of the error, right? And you're going to tell the bot how many times you're allowed to encounter that error before you do a command, before you're going to listen to what I put in your brain to do. I typically, on a system exception, I will typically take that guy down to 1 or 2. Now, I never go to 3, and I'll tell you, this is, again, Chris's unicorn world. I do 1 to 2. 1 or 2 because I'm thinking in my brain, if there's an advertisement, if the bot can't find the login screen, if the application changed, if there was an upgrade I didn't know about, or the release notes weren't complete, or I missed something in the release notes because I'm human. So if I go 3 or 4, the bot's going to keep going and going and going, and it's going to encounter the same exception over and over, and you're going to get the same screenshot over and over, right? Because in an RE framework, what happens when the bot encounters exception is it starts over. It closes everything, a system exception, I should say. When it encounters a system exception, it shuts everything down and starts over from the beginning and tries to open it up, all start again, right? So I usually do 1 or 2 because I don't want looping, because when I have looping, then my other automations that are queued up to run after these end up pending. And then in my world, we may have one run every 6 minutes. Then I have one that then I get these messages from these alerts that say I can't run because I already have one queued. Now you have a choice of your results that you want to see. You can continue. And there it goes. It's going to rethrow the exception. And it's going to rethrow the exception. Or you can ignore the exception. I have to be honest with you. I've never ignored an exception. And I can't really in my brain think of why you would ignore an exception. Now you may, I can't. You can retry or you can abort. I typically fall back to aborting. I abort the exception. I abort the process. I say, okay, stop the flow, stop the automation. Because number one, if I've got a system exception, let me back up so that you don't get confused. In some automations, you will encounter, ideally, the general practice is to open up all your systems in the initialization state. In some instances, you won't be able to do that. You may be doing a lot of processing between the initialization of opening that, and then you may run into a timeout before you can get into the process state. And you're going to learn that kind of about your applications as you go and as you start interacting with them. So there are some instances where I open up an application in the process state because I don't have a choice because I'm going to get a timeout. So when that happens, if it's in the process state, I want to abort because I've already consumed a transaction item. I've already done some pre-processing, perhaps. And so I want it to stop. I don't want to ruin any or have any more transaction data that's I can't use again, or I have to go into orchestrator and set to retry, or I mean to set to clone. So I typically, that's my general rule, I'll abort. So my result is the error action could be a retry or the error action could be an abort. Okay. That's a global exception handler. Remember, 1 per automation. And that 1 global exception handler is going to be applicable to all the exceptions within that automation. It doesn't care if it's what state it's in, what happened. If it enters into that exception, it's going to follow this global exception handler. That's why we call it global. The other one is this little guy, which is newer on the newer versions, and some of you on legacy versions of UiPath may not have this. We call it the max consecutive system exceptions. Its design is to prevent infinite loops, okay? Of your system going in and going over and over and over and trying over and over and over to get in. And you think to yourself, what's in the config? It's in the constant state. So if I set this to 0, it's not going to retry. Okay, it will, and I'll tell you why. Or the max retry number. You need to. This is going to be your orchestrator queue items. This is going to be that system exception. Okay, and make sure you pay attention down here as well. If it reaches that, if you say true, you're going to get a red. It's going to fault. Okay, if you say false, it's going to be successful in your orchestrator. That depends on you and your COE's policy or client's policy. If they want to see the fault so they can see what happened, that's what you're going to give them. If you don't like to see red, like I don't like to see red, I'm going to leave it as false. It's going to default to false, which would be it's not going to fault. It's not going to give you a red. The other guy, when you're using this guy right there, you also need to pay attention in your RE framework, in your initialization state. Now I use templates, but that's a whole different subject. So all my templates look the same. You're going to see a little guy in there. And let me see if I can find him. Right here. Okay, let's make that guy big. And you can see max consecutive system exceptions is greater than 0, and max the integer of that max is greater. So your automation is going to increase that by 1. Okay, so you're going to run, it's going to run one time, and it's going to encounter the error. Then it's going to, because of this little guy right here, it's going to start and do it again by 1. Okay, so you're going to run it automatically twice, right? Just by default of how it's set up in the RE framework. I hope everybody understands that. Okay. And if you're taking UIR, that's a test question, by the way. Just saying. All right, within your RE framework, we'll go over a couple more things. I talked faster than I typically do. You want to give screenshots. Now, if we follow, and I'm going to go through the RE framework because I've taught RE framework several times, and I'm just going to go over it for those of you that don't know what an RE framework is. Some people may still be going in there and building these in sequential order, which is probably not a good idea. Or you may say, okay, I'm getting fancy now. I'm going to put it in a flow chart with the flow decision. I would encourage you, if you do not know the RE framework, talk to Priya or somebody, or Diana, send her an email, say you'd like to have a class on the RE framework. And I'm sure any one of the MVPs will teach you the RE framework. And we as MVPs, or people that have been developing a long time, we make so many modifications to the RE framework based on the automation that we're building. So I always start with the template, and you'll see some of the rules. These are all going to be initialization errors that I add to all of my RE frameworks. Okay, the default ones can be the system guide, and ideally in a system exception, as you can see, when the bot encounters a system exception in your initialization state, it's going to go to end. Okay. Here, down here, if you have a system exception down here in your process state, you can tell where does the bot go. It goes and starts over everything over. Okay. That little arrow, that little system exception arrow goes all the way back up here. If you have a business exception, the bot's gonna throw, if you've thrown a business exception on your bot, the bot's gonna go get the next transaction. It's gonna fault that transaction item that you were working on in this particular transactional model, and it's gonna go get the next one out of your queue. Okay. Now, depending on how your queue's set up, you may be retrying that transaction. You may not be. Just that's totally up to you as a developer and what your client or your groups in your business wants you to do. And that business exception goes the same path as your system, your success, which goes in to get transaction data. So you say, okay, Chris, I get those. Now, Chris will sometimes take that little system exception guide and move them over here. And you can do that for your business exception. This is just the default RE framework. Chris moves his stuff around all the time. So if you want to know, well, how do they know where to go? Down in this little guy here, you're going to see some transactions, some set transaction status. So if we go into this invoke workflow, and this guy's going to sit right over here in your framework, and there's your set transaction status. If you want to pull them anywhere else into your automation, you're welcome to. And you can see, looking at the flow decisions, if your business exception is nothing and system exception is nothing, it's going to go to success, right? If your business, and it's not, if it encounters a business exception is not nothing, it's going to go to a business exception. Because although it's possible, you could run into a business and system exception at the same time. I think that'd be difficult, but it's possible, I suppose. But it's going to first say, is it a business exception? Then it's going to go here to this business exception guy. System exception is going to go here to this guy. Okay. In that system exception, you can see, we're retrying everything. We're taking a screenshot so that you as a developer or somebody can understand what the bot saw when it ran into exception. It's going to it's going to retry your transaction item. It's going to start everything and take it all the way back up. So it's closed all your applications. It's starting with a clean slate. In your business exception, it's going to set the transaction to failed in your orchestrator queue if you're using an orchestrator queue. And I would assume in a transaction process, if you're using a dispatcher performer, you're using an orchestrator queue. You may be using a database, but I would still recommend if you're using a database or an Excel file that you load those into a queue with a dispatcher, and then you have a performer model. It's the most efficient, it's the most easiest to track, and then it's going to stop there. Now it's going to increment your transaction number, and it's going to start over. Okay. System exception does not increment your transaction number here. These do, because your system exception is not going to get the new transaction. It's going to restart everything, right? These guys just go get the new transaction. And that's why they both go up to, let me get back to main. That's why they both go up here. Now I'm going to pause. And Diana is always so formal. She says, put them in the chat. I'm going to pause. If anybody has questions, holler if you want me to answer them now before I go on, because I don't want to lose anybody. Or if anybody's asleep.
Yeah, I don't see any questions so far, so please just speak up if you guys have any.
Okay, thanks, Diana.
Uh-huh.
All right. Linear framework has the same thing. Now I'm going to tell you what Chris does in Chris's world. Anytime the bot can encounter an application exception, I take this little guy here and I do take a screenshot. You can see I take screenshots because I like to see what the bot sees, right? And I have all these pointing into my config file. On the config file, I will put an absolute address for this guy here. Okay, absolute address meaning if it's on your C drive, if you have a shared drive here, if you're using an AWS S3 cloud, you're going to put the location of that, the absolute location of that there. Okay, that, or you can put a variable, right? That's where the bot's going to end up dropping those screenshots, so you can go dig through them and find out what the bot saw. On a business exception, if you're working with an Excel file and you've had the bot digest that Excel file to a read Excel application with a read data or something like that, you're not going to be able to see anything on the screen, right? So in a business exception, I rarely would put a screenshot unless I was actually entering data into a system. And now I avoid that. I usually use APIs to put data into a system, or I go through a scripting upload, or used to use Windshuttle. We don't use that anymore. I don't like what I call clicky bots. I don't like putting a bot into an application, having it click buttons around inside the application. Number one, I'm tired of doing selectors. I've done selectors. I've done 6 years of selectors, and I'm tired of going in and making robust selectors. APIs are much easier to do a put or a get. So if you don't know APIs, UiPath as an academy and learn how to do APIs, because you're going to find much more efficiency and much easier to work with. And I'm sure Priya will attest to that. But sometimes you may encounter a business exception if you're doing a clicky bot. So if you're doing a clicky bot, you may want to take a screenshot within that code for the clicky bot. But typically, I would do a screenshot into system exceptions. The other thing you want to keep in mind as you're doing these RE frameworks, when you may run into an exception, let's say you do have to do a clicky bot. And we'll talk about this a little bit on the 18th, and I'm just kind of jumping ahead a little bit. You want to use a lot of things, a lot of try catches, a lot of element exists on element appears, and we'll kind of go through all those different tools. But clicky bots become much more code heavy because you have to plan for so many different possible exceptions. If the buttons move, the hyperlink that used to be there is not there, or the screen resolution is different, not sure why, and you can't see the bot can't find the hyperlink on the screen. So any type of things like that you may want to use your screenshots, and also you want to send an email. Now in my COE, I'm not sure how yours is set up, or if you're doing client, or if you're building for an outside client or freelancing like Priya. In my world, what I do is I will have that bot send me an email, send the developer. We have a separate maintenance developers because we're so big on documentation. It's very easy for us. We have a developer that just does maintenance if that maintenance queue is not so huge or there's not a pressing need to change something. If an application changes and it's critical automation, and sometimes that happens when we do payroll stuff, then I usually have to jump in and do that change quickly. Not like I had to this morning. But sometimes we can queue that into a maintenance developers, and the maintenance developer will get an email from the bot saying, this is what I saw, this is the screenshot, this is the description of the error, and all of our bots generate log files. And all your bots should generate log files. And if you don't know how to generate a log file, UiPath has an academy. You can go to the academy and learn how to generate a log file. A log file is something that you can have the bot store somewhere, and you can dig through that log file and see exactly what happened, when it happened, how it happened, and helps you find how to work it. Okay. The other part about, and we'll get into this a little bit further when we get into debugging, but we need to touch on it today, is when you're building an automation. Let me see if I have. This may not. I think this is just a blank tip. Okay. Let's say I'm going to throw a sequence in here, and then I'm going to throw in here, and I'm going to say, throw in a sign. Number one, I want to say this sequence is doing this. Oop, bad spelling, sorry. Okay, I'm going to give it an annotation. That's just good coding, okay? This little guy here, each time you do one of these little activities, you're going to go in here and you're going to say A equal A plus B equals C. And that little guy right there, if you use this again and you have another A plus B equals C, then you want to make sure that they don't both say A plus B equals C, because when you're doing debugging, when you're going through your log file, and you should be generating a log file, if you do not label these activities, you're going to be churning through log files trying to find exactly what happened, because these activity labels will come out in your log file. This guy, not always, but these little guys do. So anytime you use an activity, you have for each, or even a log message. That's the wrong for each. I didn't want to use that. Even a log message, you want to label everything you do, and you can even annotate what this for each is doing. You want to use good coding practices, okay? Because that's going to help you build better automations, more robust automations. It's going to help you learn and help avoid future business rule exceptions and system exceptions. If you have already encountered them, you know how better to plan for them. Because if you think about a business, 70% of our processes are similar. And you say to me, well, that's Chris, that's impossible. And it's not really, because let's say you're building for accounting and everybody's loading something into a GL. And you have a bot that's preparing journal entries. And that bot may prepare a journal entry for 14 different parts of the company that are loading that journal entry into your GL. That's the same code. You just have to tweak it. So you would be surprised how much new code I have to build, because I use reusable code and I just tweak it. It is rare for me to have to sit down and build something from scratch. It's going to help. It helps you make better and more efficient and automations. And it's also going to make people think you know what you're doing when you may not fully know what you're doing. They're going to think, oh, this person's an expert. You could use that to leverage and get a better job if you were looking to do that, whatever it might be. Okay. All right. I talked a lot. We have 15 minutes left. Any questions at all? Nobody? See, I never know if that means I did good or if I
Here's-
totally was horrible and everybody's lost.
So somebody said that you mentioned something about the academy on the academy, but they couldn't find it. What did you mention about the academy?
If you want to go into the academy, you can learn how to use APIs in the academy.
Yeah. So I'm going to put the URL for academy on the.
And it's going to be in
Yeah.
it's going to be in your advanced developer coursework materials. But if you want to learn how to use an API instead of doing a clicky bot, that's in the academy. If you want to learn how to generate a log file, that's in the academy.
So should we go there and see if we can find?
Let's see if we can find it. I can do that. Hold on.
We
I need
put
to
the
make sure.
academy here.
I need to make sure that there's nothing
Mhm.
proprietary. Bear with me a minute. So I had stuff open on my thing before we got here. All right.
Yeah, and Lewis is a developer looking to transition to more API involved automation, so this will be helpful for him.
Okay.
Okay.
Courses. I just had a developer that got certified, and he had questions when he was in that section. So bear with me as we try and find it. We'll do a search. Oh, that's document understanding. That's not what he meant. Let's see if we can find a learning plan for advanced learning plan. I'm half blind, guys. You're gonna have to forgive me as I try and find this stuff. If you saw the way I look at people, sometimes they think I probably see right through them. Let's just go into learning plans. There are my computer. State machines, RE framework, activity project settings, attended automation. I will tell you what, leave your email with Diana and I will get with Andres and find out what section that was in, because it's been a long time since I took the certification course. And I will send you an email and show you where. Instead of digging through this and having everybody lost, unless Priya, do you know where it's at? Yeah, oh, Priya.
I'm looking.
Can't remember
So
at the top of my head. Like, yeah, I'll look into it too. So we are looking for a chapter that's just talking about like how to use the API, right?
Yeah, it's about coding with, it's building with APIs, yeah. It talks about Postman and things like that.
Yeah. And just to clarify, I mean, like, I'm a bit confused with Louis' question. Like, it's he was asking, like, how do you build an API? So just to clarify, Louis, I think what Chris was saying was like, for certain applications, like let's say like ServiceNow or SAP, for instance, they might have like APIs that are open to developers that you can like possibly like use, because they might
Yes.
have certain methods that are exposed. But this course that we are talking about is not for you to build an API for an existing site, but this is to leverage an existing API that's already built out for you.
Correct. And you'll find, and good point. I'm sorry I didn't catch on to that. Also, Priya, thank you for that. SAP has BOPIs, what we call BOPIs, which are business APIs. Tons of them. Most organizations prefer you to third-party softwares, vendors, will provide you with APIs that you can use. And they prefer you do that because it's less risky for them to have a bot clicking around in their system than it is for you to go and talk to an API. What else? Anybody else? Boy, Diana, I must have nailed it today.
Chris, there's one more question from
Sure.
Glenn. He's asking like, what are the best uses for global exception handler?
I use a global exception handler in everything. I have a global exception handler in every, and then you can see that that was my template that I use. That RE framework, and I closed it. The way we build in my COEs is we have two templates. Everybody uses either the transactional or the linear one. Each one of those templates comes with the global exception handler, and the expectation during a code review is that you use that global exception handler. I don't think that's my personal preference, is that everybody uses the global exception handler. I don't think there's any risk in using it on a small one, an email management one, for example, compared to using it on a very complex one, because you can only have one per automation. So I require a global exception handler in all my automation. Hope that helped. Nothing else? Okay. Let's close this guy. I'm going to look at the screen, and next week, guys, we are going to be talking about error handling. Should have been exception handling. That's my fault. We're going to talk about try catches. We're going to talk about choosing the right exceptions when you put it in a try catch, assigning certain exceptions. There's a ton of different exceptions, .com exceptions, argument exceptions, Excel exceptions. There are tons of different kinds of exceptions that you may encounter in any of your automations, and it's important for you to learn how to find those, where to find those, and how to decipher which exceptions are which, so that you can put them into your try catches correctly. If you just do a try catch with a system exception, you may miss some, or if you just do one with a business exception, you may miss some because your bot may encounter one it's going to try and define. We're going to talk about retry scopes. We're going to talk about all of those little element exists and things like that, on element appears and things like that. We're going to, next session on next Monday, we're going to actually go in and we're going to start working with some tools that are in Studio. My general rule, just so you can prepare, if you have not used try catches, I generally put most everything that we do in a try catch. It's just a good standard exception planning tool. And then the last session, we're going to talk about, like I said, debugging. And we're going to talk about how to debug a file compared to debugging your entire automation, and how to set toggle points, clear toggle points, look through the screen and look into the different variables and see what you've defined and things like that. And hopefully that will help answer some of the questions that we always get that say, I don't know why it doesn't work today and it worked yesterday. And guys, I do this for free too. Can you imagine that? Diana doesn't pay me or Priya anything. All right, I don't have anything else, Diana. If anybody else doesn't have anything else.
Yeah, any other questions anybody else wants to ask? And Lewis, we will look for that course and send that to you if we can find it.
And I'll get with Andres tomorrow, Lewis. He's not here today, and find out.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris and Priya, for running the session. And everybody, I put in the chat the URL to next week's session. So please join that. And thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate it.